Before we delve into the main topic of today's video, we need to talk about Immortals of Aveum as it ties into what today's story is about. Have you heard of this game? A lot of you may not have, but for those who have, you'll recognize it to be that first-person spellcaster game. It's kind of like Doom, but with magic is kind of the best way I can describe it. It is a project that is admirable in its conception and what they were trying to do with it, but ultimately it came out kind of mid. You can see right here that on Metacritic, it's got a 69 nice Metascore from 77 critic reviews, and even the user score is kind of hovering in that area, sitting at a 6.0. Now, you'll notice that the number of user ratings is pretty low. You'll see right here that there's only 119 user ratings, which suggests that not a lot of people bought this game, and that's why we're seeing such a low review rate for user reviews. And then things look even more grim if you look at Immortals of Aveum's performance on Steam. Look at this paltry number of all-time peak concurrent players. A mere 482 players is the most amount of people playing this game at once, which means that this game sold most likely paltry sums. And the end result was that it didn't take long for the studio who developed this game to suffer layoffs. So right here you can see this Polygon article from September 14th, 2023 that broke the news that Immortals of Aveum studio lays off nearly half of staff weeks after release. The news broke before it was confirmed by Brett Robbins, who's the founder and CEO of Ascendant Studio, who tweeted the following image with this message: "Today we're heartbroken as we part ways with friends and colleagues at Ascendant Studios, about 45% of our team." So what went wrong with this game? Well, the fact of the matter is that this game just didn't really stand out or do anything special ultimately. Again, the concept is really cool, but at the end of the day, the market was saturated with just far better games. The marketing for Immortals of Aveum wasn't particularly outstanding either. And there was just nothing about the marketing campaign of this game that presented something that looked utterly incredible. It looked like it might be a fun, good time for a short campaign, but it just felt like a game that didn't ultimately stand out from the pack, especially with the quality bar of games just getting higher and higher. And I'll say again, I admire that this game was made at all, because this is an EA published game, and we want EA and similar publishers to make more sort of single player focused games. But even in that area, you still have to find ways to kind of push the boundaries in certain respects and stand out from the pack and market your game well if you want that game to sell well. And Immortals of Aveum, unfortunately, just kind of missed the mark on those fronts. It's by no means like the bad, terrible, awful game. You'll have like an enjoyable enough time if you check it out. But in terms of its substance and quality bar, it wasn't at a level where it garnered mass interest or at a level that would get people to spend $60 to $70 on a title like this. We got even more insight into the development of this game when news outlet IGN published the following report on February 13th, 2024, discussing the general state of layoffs in the game's industry and how among the studios who were hit was the developers of Immortals of Aveum. And something that was revealed in that report is that the cost of Immortals of Aveum sat around $125 million, and that includes both development cost and marketing. Apparently, the game cost $85 million to make and $40 million to market and distribute. To me, it doesn't feel like this game's marketing cost around $40 million, because I really hardly saw it anywhere before its launch. I almost forgot that the game launched once it did, or that it was supposed to launch on that day. And then when it comes to what happened during development, well, this is a quote from a developer who decided to remain anonymous, who spoke out about what their experience was like when making this game. They stated, "There was some serious talent on the development team, but trying to make a AAA single-player shooter in today's market was a truly awful idea, especially since it was a new IP that was also trying to leverage Unreal Engine 5. What ended up launching was a bloated, repetitive campaign that was far too long." It's crazy to think that this game's being called far too long when it really isn't that long. To complete the main story is roughly 15 hours. If you do a mix of main campaign and side quests, that's 20 hours. But yeah, I do think that if you're going to come out with a new IP for a first-person shooter, you've really got to pull all stops with just its ambition and also just how it is presented to people. And Immortals of Aveum just didn't accomplish anything extraordinary on either of those fronts. And so there are plenty of good reasons for why Immortals of Aveum failed. It's unfortunate that it failed, but you kind of understand why it didn't garner that much interest, why it kind of flopped. and it isn't necessarily representative of the state of single-player games as a whole. But news outlet Kotaku will have you believe otherwise. With this headline, there's a reason why we discussed Immortals of Aveum. It's because Kotaku uses this game as some kind of proof that it's a grim time for single-player games, essentially kind of putting the notion out there that you can see from Immortals of Aveum's failure that single-player games are just in a generally bad place, or that they're generally just performing poorly or are kind of unsustainable. Here's the article in question that the tweet links to. Immortals of Aveum proves it's a grim time for single-player games. And looking down, they highlight how there is a dire outlook right now on the state of the AAA market. To a degree, yes, when it comes to just how overbloated budgets can be, which is one aspect of this article that, is a point to discuss. But then there are paragraphs like these that makes you question just what this article is trying to say and question its argument. It says right here, on paper, single-player games like Immortals of Aveum sound ideal for those who aren't looking for another life-sucking life service game. But without better sales or in-game purchases to bring in money, it seems a single-player model is only sustainable on games with smaller budgets, which is entirely not true when you look at 2023, one of the best years in gaming ever. And how many of the best video games that year and how many bestsellers were single-player games that made their money back and then some, and also were, nominees at the Game Awards, and all these things garnered both critical acclaim and commercial success. This statement right here is plain and simply not true. The article then talks about just the general state of budgets in video games, how budgets are increasing for single-player games, but nothing else about the market has changed to compensate. Did we miss the part where AAA games went from $60 to $70, on top of the fact that many AAA single-player games sell, like deluxe editions and, more expensive editions, or just shove in microtransactions, shoehorn them in these types of experiences where they don't belong? Did we miss all that? The article continues, perhaps not every game needs to aspire to cutting-edge visual fidelity, and by saving money on graphics can make back its budget without relying on multiplayer and live service elements. That's true. Not every game has to have the most photorealistic graphics and have the, the kind of insane budget that AAA games do. That's why indie games, a lot of them have this sort of artistic element to them, have a unique art style to compensate for the fact that they can't go crazy with the graphics. And those kinds of games do exist, but that doesn't mean there isn't a place for games that are cutting edge and have a high visual fidelity and have a high budget, as long as you have, people at the leadership who can weigh the risks and rewards well. You know what I mean? Like GTA 6. That game is probably going to be one of the, if not the most expensive game ever made. And that's a game that, without question, is going to make its money back and then some, especially once GTA 6's online mode launches. And Take-Two kind of knows this, which is why they can afford to pour in the kind of budget that this game has, especially with the money that they made with GTA 5 and GTA Online for that game. And so those kinds of games can exist as long as, you're not stupid about it and don't, issue a budget for a game that isn't suited for what you can afford and what you can make back with that game. And so all kinds of games can exist, and all kinds of games have their risks and rewards. You just have to know how to assess them, which is obviously easier said than done. And while I do agree that the question of what if a game didn't have the biggest, most expensive version of itself is a good question to ask, and while I do agree that many companies do suffer from bloated budgets that leads to, financially less than ideal results that then the developers, the staff have to pay for and are the scapegoats instead of, the leadership who miscalculated all this stuff. While that stuff's legitimately a good discussion to have and stuff that I do agree with, the notion that Immortals of Aveum in particular represents a grim prospect for single-player games, that this game is the prime example of that, and that big-budget, highly ambitious single-player experiences cannot succeed without in-game purchases to bring in money and stuff like that, this is something that has been disproven by companies who have really reached for the stars when it comes to quality, and, consumer friendliness. As plenty of people in the games industry, plenty of games industry pundits have highlighted, here's, for example, Shinobi602 retweeting this Kotaku headline as misleading, saying that about 50% of the top 20 best-selling games in MPD last year were single-player. So no, this headline makes absolutely no sense. Next up, we have Nick Calandra from Second Wind, who straight up called this headline goofy clickbait and pointed out that more than half of the top-selling games in 2023 were single-player games. Right here we have Casey Explosion, who said, failure after failure of live service garbage, huge multiplayer games shut down again and again. This is fine, but one game flops and, Immortals of Aveum of all games, then now all of a sudden the discussion is the end of single player. This is some bullshit headline, and it's exactly the wrong lesson to take away from this. Let me explain as she goes on, just kind of stating the obvious, essentially. Discussing why Immortals of Aveum in particular was destined to fail, discussing all of the various missteps that led to the downfall of this one particular single-player game. And look, in both the realm of live service and single-player experiences, you win some, you lose some. In the case of Immortals of Aveum, that just happened to be one of those games that didn't take off. It happens across all genres of games. One such game flopping does not mean it's the doom of the genre as a whole, especially with a game like Immortals of Aveum, where its missteps are so kind of glaring and obvious. For every Immortals of Aveum, you got amazing, high-budget, AAA, single-player experiences that have launched to great success. People have taken to social media to shout out these games to prove that Kotaku is just kind of not making much sense here. Baldur's Gate 3 is the primary example. Alan Wake 2, Tears of the Kingdom, Spider-Man 2, Resident Evil 4 Remake, and the list just goes on, especially for just 2023 alone. Now, it should be noted that Alan Wake 2, while it isn't like completely bombing a la Immortals of Aveum, it is not achieving the level of sales that Remedy games would have liked. But generally, when you look at games like Tears of the Kingdom, Spider-Man 2, Baldur's Gate 3, Resident Evil 4 Remake, and look at their absolutely magnificent sales and just the amount of profit that they brought in for the respective companies, it's just impossible to take this Kotaku headline and their arguments seriously. And yeah, if you look at the responses to Kotaku's clickbaity headline here, aside from the quote tweets that I just showed you, plenty of people highlighting all of the incredible single-player games that perform really well and are critically acclaimed and, is keeping the respective companies at bay. People highlighting that, Immortals of Aveum doesn't prove that single-player games are dying or that, it's in a grim state. It just proves that you don't release certain new games like this right after a massively hyped AAA giant of a game just released, like Baldur's Gate 3. Remember when Titanfall 2 launched? And I know that's a multiplayer game and all, but the timing of when you launch a game also matters. If you're, sandwiched between Battlefield and Call of Duty and you're a new IP like Titanfall or a newer IP, then yeah, it's bound to fail. Similarly, if you're Immortals of Aveum, which, throughout its marketing already wasn't doing well, and you release it alongside a giant like Baldur's Gate 3, yeah, people are not going to pay attention to it. And beyond the games that I've already mentioned, there's Final Fantasy 16, the upcoming Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth, which is probably going to sell incredibly well. Cyberpunk is doing incredibly well, both the base game and the Phantom Liberty expansion. RoboCop Rogue City, which is kind of more of like a AA game, apparently that game's doing well, so on and so forth. Like, it's a great time for single-player games. We've been seeing amazing single-player experiences. So many indies are also succeeding. When it comes to single-player experiences and non-live service experiences, there's so much choice right now. There's so much high-quality stuff going on right now and coming out right now. There's so much inspired stuff that honestly, we're eating well. Like 2023 especially was a nice little kick in the butt for single player experiences, like in a good kind of kick in the butt. And so I don't know what we're talking about here with a grim time for single-player games. And then beyond that, this tweet has already been community noted. The community notes highlight how half the best-selling games last year were single-player games, and this article makes no mention of how successful Baldur's Gate 3 was, which has 500,000 positive reviews and won Game of the Year at the Game Awards. Which, yeah. And the reason I felt the desire to even make a video about this was because the narrative of single-player games are dying has been thrown around before in bad faith. The likes of EA, do you remember when they're like, we want a future where it's all live services because nobody plays single-player games anymore? And that's been disproven time and time again. And so for an article like this to come out and to kind of try to push that narrative, which is entirely false, which can be proven false, to come out with this headline and to try to forward this narrative that is putting a bad image on single-player games, which is such a desired experience and something that so many people still play. This kind of stuff just rubs me the wrong way, especially with how much I love single-player games and with how misrepresentative of the state of single-player games this headline is. And so I felt the need to just kind of clear the air for those who saw this headline and bought into it in any way, shape, or form. I feel like nobody really took this seriously. Like, anyone who's kept up with gaming these last few years alone know that this is just plain and simply not true. Again, there's a discussion to be had about budgets in games and how there is so much mishandling of budget and leadership and how that leads to like certain games not meeting financial expectations even though they sold really well, and just having these overbloated expectations and all of that leading to layoffs and stuff like that. Like, all of that is valid, but generally the state of single player games is pretty amazing. But the discussion of, leadership handling budgets and stuff like that, and certain projects getting overblown in their scope and being mishandled in that regard, that's a separate topic from the state of single-player games. And this notion that single-player games are in a grim state, there's no way that can be validated based on the releases we've seen these last couple of years. But that's just one man's take on all of this. Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts and opinions are on Kotaku's article here and the general discussion surrounding this idea that it's a grim time for single-player games. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.